What would you do if your father's entire inheritance amounted to a piece of ground so steep and so useless that not even the men who wanted everything else in the valley had bothered to take it from him? For Iris Calloway, that question arrived not as a riddle but as a lawyer's flat recitation in the autumn of 1889, in a cramped land office in Cascade Falls, Washington Territory, 3 weeks after a falling cedar had ended her father's life on a logging crew 40 miles up the mountain. Edmund Calloway had spent 18 years cruising timber for other men's fortunes and had died owning almost nothing of his own, a fact that surprised no one who understood how modestly the trade actually paid, but buried in the land office's dusty files was a single forgotten claim he'd quietly filed and paid the modest fees on for a decade: 40 acres of near vertical mountainside, unloggable, unfarmable, notable only for the thundering falls, the old Chinook name translated roughly as Widow's Vale. Iris inherited it because no one else had ever wanted it badly enough to contest it, a fact the town found genuinely funny when she walked out of that office with the deed in her hand and $11 in her pocket besides. It looked like the cruelest kind of inheritance a grieving daughter could receive, a mountainside so useless the town found genuine amusement in her loss. But her father had not filed that claim by accident, and hidden behind the endless curtain of falling water was a cabin no one in Cascade Falls knew existed, holding a secret that would not only give Iris her life back, but would finally return to an entire valley of families something that had been stolen from them a generation before any of them understood they'd lost it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Iris Calloway, a story that had, in truth, been waiting behind that waterfall for far longer than she ever imagined. If you've ever been handed something everyone else called worthless, tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear about it tonight, whatever shape that inheritance happened to take, however small or strange it seemed at the time. Iris had grown up almost entirely in the company of her father, moving between logging camps across the Washington Territory from the time she was old enough to remember any settled home at all, her mother having died of childbed fever before Iris turned 2. Edmund Calloway worked as a timber cruiser, one of the small, particular trade of men employed by logging outfits to walk a stand of forest ahead of the saws and judge, with an experienced eye, exactly what it held, the bored feet in a Douglas fir, the grade of a hemlock stand, the slope and drainage that would determine whether a given hillside could be logged profitably at all or would simply swallow a company's investment whole. It was demanding, solitary work that most men considered unfit for raising a daughter alongside, but Edmund had never had the luxury of choosing between his trade and his child, and so Iris grew up walking timber claims at his side almost as soon as she could keep pace with his stride, learning to read a forest the way other children learned their letters. He taught her to judge a tree's age by its bark and crown before she was 10, to recognize the particular telltale lean of ground that would slide in a hard rain, to understand that a stand of old growth looked, to an untrained, like nothing more than an undifferentiated green wall, when in truth every acre told its own exact story to anyone patient enough to actually walk it rather than simply glance at it from a train window. The land never exaggerates, Iris, he used to tell her, resting a broad hand against some ancient trunk while he counted growth rings from a fresh stump nearby. Men do that. The ground just grows exactly what its soil and its water and its weather allow, and if you walk it carefully enough, it will tell you the whole truth of itself without a single lie in the telling. There was a particular ritual to those early lessons that stayed with Iris long after she'd outgrown needing them, her father pausing at the edge of any new stand of timber and simply standing still for several minutes before taking a single step further in, listening, he told her once, to what the place wanted to say before he started asking it questions of his own. She found that patience frustrating as a small girl, eager to keep moving through whatever forest they were cruising that season, but she came to understand, as she grew older, that this stillness was the actual heart of her father's trade, the discipline that separated a cruiser whose figures could be trusted from one whose careless haste cost a logging company its investment. He never raised his voice teaching her, never once suggested her questions were foolish however elementary, and Iris absorbed, alongside the technical substance of his instruction, an entire philosophy of attention that she would carry into every corner of her adult life, long after she'd left the actual practice of timber cruising behind for a schoolroom. Iris absorbed that conviction as completely as she absorbed every other lesson her father offered her, and it shaped her into precisely the kind of watchful, unhurried observer that made her, by her late teens, nearly as capable a timber cruiser as her father himself, though no logging outfit in the territory would have considered hiring a woman for the work regardless of her skill. She found other, gentler uses for her training instead, taking a position as schoolteacher in Cascade Falls at 19, a town built entirely around the Thorn Logging Company's mill and dependent on its wages for nearly every family within its boundaries, and she came to love the particular satisfaction of watching a child's understanding sharpen the same patient way her father's had once sharpened hers, one careful observation compounding into genuine competence over seasons rather than single lessons. She saw her father only during the brief stretches between logging contracts, since his work took him wherever a company needed a stand properly assessed, but their letters passed constantly between camps and town, and Iris kept every one of them in a small tin box beneath her bed, a habit that would matter more than she could have imagined once his letters stopped arriving altogether. Cascade Falls itself existed, by 1889, almost entirely at the pleasure of the Thorn Logging Company, whose founder, a hard, ambitious man named Gideon Thorn, had arrived in the territory some 3 decades before and built, across those 30 years, the single dominant timber operation in the whole valley, employing directly or indirectly nearly every family within a day's ride of the mill, a dependence so complete that few in town could have named another way of life at all. Gideon had died a decade before Iris's own story began, leaving the company to his son, and by 1889 it operated under the considerably colder management of Gideon's grandson, a sharp, meticulous man named Augustus Thorn, who had grown up entirely within the company's wealth and carried none of his grandfather's rougher, occasionally generous instincts toward the workers whose labor had built that wealth in the first place. Edmund Calloway had cruised timber for the Thorn Company on and off for most of Iris's childhood, competent, respected work that nonetheless left the family in the same modest circumstances as nearly every other logging household in the valley, entirely dependent on wages that rose and fell at the company's own discretion. Iris was 25 and settled into her 3rd year teaching at the Cascade Falls schoolhouse when word reached her, carried down the mountain by an exhausted foreman, that her father had been killed instantly by a falling cedar during a routine cruise on a remote Thorn Company timber claim, the kind of accident that happened often enough in that dangerous trade that the company's response amounted to little more than a brief note of condolence and a modest final wage payment, delivered by the same foreman who had ridden half a day to bring her the news in person rather than trust it to a letter. Iris buried her father in the small logging town cemetery with a grief that felt, in its rawest early days, almost too large to be contained by a body her own size, and it was only in the weeks following the funeral, settling what little remained of his affairs, that the land office clerk mentioned, almost apologetically, the existence of the old claim on Widow's Vale Falls, filed and quietly maintained for a full decade without Edmund ever once mentioning it in any of the letters Iris had so carefully kept. She spent those first raw weeks doing the small, necessary work of closing out a life that had never accumulated much to close, sorting through her father's few belongings in the boarding house room he'd kept between logging contracts, finding little beyond worn work clothes, a handful of tools, and the neat stack of her own letters to him tied with twine, kept, she realized with a fresh ache, with the same careful attention he'd brought to everything else in his life. She found herself, in those weeks, unexpectedly grateful for the schoolroom's daily demands, the 20-odd children who needed her steady presence regardless of her own grief, understanding only later that the routine had likely kept her from the kind of collapse a less occupied woman might have suffered. It was in exactly this state, still raw and still uncertain what her own life might now look like, that she walked into the land office and heard, for the first time, her father's name attached to a claim she had never once known existed. The claim itself, when Iris finally hiked the difficult trail up to see it for the first time that October, explained immediately why no one had ever bothered contesting her father's quiet ownership of it, the whole parcel a study in exactly the kind of ground a working timber company would walk straight past without a second glance. 40 acres of near vertical mountainside, split nearly in two by the thundering cascade the old Chinook name called Widow's Vale, offered nothing a logging company could profitably extract, the slope too steep for safe felling, the ground too unstable for a reliable road, the timber itself, what little of it clung to the difficult grade, stunted and commercially worthless compared to the vast stands of prime old growth the Thorn Company was steadily working through elsewhere in the valley. What would a man who spent his entire working life expertly judging land's true value possibly want with 40 acres everyone else, including men who wanted everything else he might have claimed, considered genuinely worthless. Whatever answer you're imagining, we promise Iris found something behind that waterfall stranger and more important to Cascade Falls than any ordinary inheritance could have been. Iris stood at the base of the falls for a long while that first afternoon, soaked through with spray, understanding that her father had never done anything without a considered reason, and that this claim, however useless it appeared, must have meant something to him she had not yet been given the chance to understand. It took her 3 separate visits over as many weeks, each one a demanding climb up the difficult mountain trail, before she noticed what her father's own trained eye had apparently noticed decades before her, a narrow, almost invisible ledge running behind the curtain of falling water itself, wide enough for careful footing, leading toward a shallow recess in the rock face that the falls themselves had carved and concealed across centuries. She worked her way along that ledge on her 3rd visit, soaked and shaking with a mixture of cold and something closer to anticipation than fear, and found, tucked into the recess where no casual observer would ever think to look, a small, weathered cabin built directly into the rock overhang, its timbers gone silver with age but its construction, she could see even at a glance, remarkably sound, clearly the work of someone who understood wood and weather as thoroughly as her own father had. The cabin's single room held a narrow cot, a rusted stove, and, most importantly, a heavy trunk secured with a simple iron latch that gave way easily beneath her hands, revealing a thick collection of papers wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow stayed dry across whatever years they'd waited there. The papers, once Iris carried them back to town and spread them across her own kitchen table by lamplight, revealed themselves to be the careful field notes and survey records of a federal land surveyor named Marcus Teal, dated to the early 1860s, decades before Iris's own father had ever set foot in the valley. Marcus Teal's notes, meticulous and increasingly troubled across their later entries, documented the original government survey establishing the boundaries of the public timber land that the Homestead Act had opened for settlement across that stretch of the territory, land meant to be available in modest, workable parcels to any family willing to prove up a claim and work it honestly. His final entries, written in a hand grown noticeably tighter with strain, described his discovery that a considerable portion of his own original survey had been quietly altered after the fact, boundary markers redrawn and filed with the Territorial Land Office under a second, falsified set of records that shifted vast tracts of the best timberland, land legally meant for a dozen or more individual homestead claims, into a single enormous parcel registered to one man alone, Gideon Thorne. Teal's notes described his horrified realization that Thorne had bribed a corrupt land office clerk to substitute the falsified survey for his own honest one, and that when Teal attempted to report the fraud through proper channels, he found himself abruptly dismissed from federal service on fabricated charges of incompetence. His original field notes and true survey records declared lost in a records office fire that Teal himself strongly suspected had been no accident at all. Rather than simply destroying his one remaining copy or handing it over to authorities he no longer trusted, Teal had built this hidden cabin behind the falls over the following months, working alone and telling no one, preserving his true survey records in the one place he was certain Thorne's considerable influence would never think to search, in the hope that someday, someone with reason to look closely enough would find proof of exactly what had been stolen and from whom. His final entry, dated just before he apparently left the territory for good, expressed his shame at not having the courage to fight the matter publicly himself, and his hope that the truth, once found, would still matter to whoever eventually uncovered it. Iris understood almost immediately what she now held and how directly its consequences reached into her own present circumstances. Gideon Thorne's fraudulently acquired timber holdings had grown, across 3 decades, into the entire foundation of the Thorne Logging Company's fortune, the very company that employed nearly every family in Cascade Falls, including her own late father, at wages that depended entirely on the company's continued, unquestioned control of land that Marcus Teal's true survey proved had never legally belonged to Gideon Thorne at all. If Teal's account was accurate, dozens of homestead claims that should have gone to individual settler families generations before had instead been absorbed into a single company's holdings, and Iris was now the only person alive who knew it, holding evidence that could unravel the entire foundation of Augustus Thorne's inheritance, evidence that also explained, with a clarity that steadied her more than it frightened her, exactly why her own quiet, careful father had spent a full decade paying the modest fees to keep a seemingly worthless claim on Widow's Vale Falls entirely to himself. She found herself, in the weeks that followed, thinking often of Marcus Teal in much the way she had come to think of her own father, a man whose careful, exacting hand she recognized in every page of his survey work, as though the two of them had become, through the accident of her discovery, a matched pair of unfinished stories she alone had been given the chance to complete. She pictured him working alone in that hidden cabin decades before, carrying the particular loneliness of a man who has uncovered a wrong too large to fix quietly and too dangerous to announce, and she wondered whether he had felt, in his final weeks in the territory, anything like the mixture of fear and clarity she now carried herself, walking toward a reckoning with a company considerably more powerful than any single schoolteacher. She found she could not read his final entries without a grief that surprised her for a man dead or vanished decades before her own birth, and she understood, turning those brittle pages by lamplight, that she had not simply uncovered an old fraud. She had been handed the unfinished second half of two men's courage, her father's and Teal's both, and it fell to her now to see it through to some kind of honest close. She began to suspect, turning Teal's papers over by lamplight across several difficult evenings, that her father had found this same cabin years before, likely during one of his many cruising expeditions through the valley's difficult terrain, and had filed his own claim on the surrounding acreage specifically to protect and quietly guard whatever he'd discovered there, without ever finding the right moment or the necessary courage to act on it fully himself. It explained, she realized with a fresh ache layered atop her grief, his particular quiet seriousness in his final years, a weight she had noticed but never understood, and she found herself wishing, more than once across those long evenings, that he had trusted her enough to share the burden before it became, so suddenly and so completely, entirely hers alone to carry. She moved carefully through that autumn and into the following winter, telling no one in Cascade Falls what she had found, letting the town believe only that Edmund Calloway's daughter was sentimentally attached to a worthless mountain claim, a story that required nothing further of anyone's conscience. By day she continued teaching, careful to keep her routine visibly unchanged, and by lamplight she cross-referenced Teal's original survey figures against the Territorial Land Office's current records, walking the disputed boundary lines herself on weekends with a borrowed transit and the same patient, careful attention her father had spent her whole childhood teaching her to bring to difficult terrain. She found exactly what Teal's papers had promised, current Thorn Company boundary markers that did not match the original 1860s survey at all, shifted, by her own careful measurement, to enclose several thousand additional acres of prime timber land that should, by rights, have been divided among individual homestead claims decades before. She found, too, the names of at least a dozen families still living in Cascade Falls whose grandparents, she confirmed through careful, quiet inquiry at the county recorder's office, had filed homestead claims on that exact disputed acreage in the 1860s, claims that had somehow never been properly finalized, the families instead ending up as tenant loggers on land that should rightfully have been their own. It was Anders Lindgren, an elderly Norwegian immigrant logger whose own grandfather's name Iris found among those unfinalized homestead filings, who gave her the confirmation and the courage she needed to move forward. Anders had grown up hearing his grandfather's bitter, half-believed stories about a homestead claim the family had supposedly lost to some clerical error decades before their own arrival in Cascade Falls, a grievance the family had long since stopped repeating aloud, having learned across 2 generations that questioning the Thorn Company's ownership of anything in the valley accomplished nothing but trouble. When Iris laid Marcus Teal's original survey beside the county's current maps at his kitchen table, Anders sat in silence for a long while before telling her, in a voice rough with an old, complicated anger, that his grandfather had died still believing the loss had somehow been his own fault, a shame the family had carried for decades without ever understanding it wasn't theirs to carry at all. Word travels strangely in a small logging town, and though Iris told no one beyond Anders Lindgren what she had actually found, her sudden careful surveying trips and her long evenings at the county recorder's office did not escape notice entirely. Augustus Thorne himself came to call at the schoolhouse on a raw February afternoon, pleasant and unhurried in the particular way of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted, offering to purchase the Widow's Vale claim outright for $50, a considerable sum for land everyone still believed worthless, framing it as simple generosity toward a grieving young woman with no practical use for difficult mountain terrain. When Iris, understanding exactly what such a sale would mean, declined as politely as she could manage, his tone cooled by precisely one careful degree, and he reminded her, almost in passing, that the school board that employed her answered, in most practical matters, to men who valued the Thorne Company's continued goodwill rather highly. The pressure did not end there. Over the following weeks, several of the schoolhouse's modest supplies were mysteriously delayed in their delivery from the company store. Two families who had begun quietly speaking with Iris about their grandparents' old homestead claims found their own logging contracts abruptly reviewed for unspecified irregularities, and one night in March, someone attempted to force the hidden cabin's trunk, though whoever had managed to locate it, evidently by following Iris's own trail more closely than she'd realized, had not found the second, smaller copy of Teal's most damning pages that Iris had, by then, already moved to a trusted hiding place in town. Those uncertain weeks tested Iris's nerve more thoroughly than the steep falls trail ever had, since a difficult climb was at least an honest kind of danger, while Augustus Thorne's polite, unhurried threats carried a different and more corrosive kind of fear entirely. She found herself, more than once, questioning whether her father's decade of careful silence had been simple fear or something closer to wisdom, a question she never fully resolved even after the matter was settled, though she came to believe, in her steadier hours, that he had simply been waiting for the right moment or the right ally, neither of which had arrived in time for him to act himself. She took some comfort in the knowledge that she now had both, imperfect as her own courage sometimes felt against a company as established as Thorne's. She understood she was running out of both time and patience, and that Augustus Thorne, whatever his private unease, would not simply allow a schoolteacher with an old survey to walk unopposed into a public reckoning. So instead of going first to the Territorial Land Office, she went instead, with Anders Lindgren's help, to quietly gather sworn statements from every family whose grandparents' names appeared among the disputed homestead filings, assembling across several careful weeks a small but genuine coalition of Cascade Falls' oldest working families standing together for the first time in living memory. It took the better part of 2 months to gather what she needed, statements from 9 families whose original homestead claims had been quietly absorbed into Thorne Company land, Marcus Teal's original survey and his account of the bribery that had falsified it, and Iris's own careful modern resurvey confirming the discrepancy down to the rod. She timed her presentation for the Territorial Land Office's spring review session, the one formal opportunity each year for disputed claims to be heard before a traveling federal land commissioner, and she walked into that hearing carrying Teal's original papers, her own survey, and 9 families' sworn testimony, flanked by Anders Lindgren and several of the valley's oldest logging households. Augustus Thorne, seated among the company's usual legal representation with the same unhurried confidence he'd carried to the schoolhouse weeks before, went pale and still as the commissioner's own surveyor confirmed, point by careful point, that the current Thorne Company boundaries did not match the original federal survey, and that the discrepancy corresponded precisely to Marcus Teal's decades-old account of a bribed land office clerk and a falsified filing. Thorne argued, predictably, that whatever his grandfather might have done 30 years before bore no weight against him personally, and that the company's current operations, however their foundation had been established, employed and supported the entire valley regardless. But the commissioner, moved as much by 9 families' plain, dignified testimony as by any single document, ruled that same week to formally reopen the disputed acreage for proper homestead adjudication, ordering the Thorne Company to relinquish clear title to any parcel a family could establish rightful historical claim to. What followed unfolded gradually over the following 2 years, the way real restitution in a working timber valley so often does, without any single dramatic reckoning but without meaningful resistance either, once the commissioner's ruling gave Cascade Falls families the standing they had lacked for 3 decades. 9 families, Anders Lindgren's among them, finally received clear title to land their grandparents should have owned outright since the 1860s, modest but genuine homestead acreage that let several of them, for the first time in family memory, work land they owned rather than land they merely logged for wages. Augustus Thorne's company survived the ruling, since the valley still depended on its mill for the bulk of its livelihood, but its holdings shrank meaningfully, and the easy, unquestioned deference Cascade Falls had shown the Thorne name for 3 generations thinned considerably as families who had once simply accepted company dominance as the natural order of things began, for the first time, negotiating from genuine independent standing. What followed unfolded gradually over the following 2 years, the way real restitution in a working timber valley so often does, without any single dramatic reckoning but without meaningful resistance either, once the commissioner's ruling gave Cascade Falls families the standing they had lacked for 3 decades. 9 families, Anders Lindgren's among them, finally received clear title to land their grandparents should have owned outright since the 1860s, modest but genuine homestead acreage that let several of them, for the first time in family memory, work land they owned rather than land they merely logged for wages. Augustus Thorne's company survived the ruling, since the valley still depended on its mill for the bulk of its livelihood, but its holdings shrank meaningfully, and the easy, unquestioned deference Cascade Falls had shown the Thorne name for 3 generations thinned considerably as families who had once simply accepted company dominance as the natural order of things began, for the first time, negotiating from genuine independent standing. The mill itself continued operating, since the valley's economy still depended on it too heavily to simply abandon, but Thorne found himself, within the following year, negotiating timber rights and wages with a considerably more organized body of independent landholders than his family had ever previously needed to answer to, several of whom now controlled acreage adjoining the company's own remaining holdings and could no longer simply be dismissed or intimidated the way tenant loggers once had been. He remained a prominent man in Cascade Falls afterward, since no single ruling could entirely undo 3 generations of accumulated wealth and standing, but Iris noticed, in the months that followed, that his prominence had shifted into something closer to wary negotiation than the easy, unquestioned authority his grandfather's name had once commanded throughout the valley. Iris kept the Widow's Vale claim entirely her own, building a modest cabin of her own construction near the fall's base once the legal matter was fully settled, not behind the water where her father's secret had waited so long, but in plain sight, a home she could walk to from town without the difficult climb Marcus Teal's hiding place had always required. She preserved his original survey records, carefully framed, in the Cascade Falls schoolhouse where she continued teaching, hanging them beside a small brass plate bearing both Teal's name and her own father's, a reminder to every child who passed beneath it of what patient, careful attention could still uncover, decades after everyone else had decided the matter was simply an old, unwinnable grievance. She thought often, walking the Falls trail that had once seemed so senselessly steep and worthless, of her father's voice teaching her that the ground never lies, and of Marcus Teal's careful, courageous hand in those water-stained survey papers, and understood that both men had tried, each in his own trade, to teach her the very same lesson, that land, like truth, kept an honest record regardless of how thoroughly powerful men tried to redraw its lines, waiting only for someone patient enough to walk it properly and read what it actually held. She thought, too, of the particular grief of a father who had known the truth for a decade and never found the words to share its weight with his own daughter, and understood that she carried no simple lesson from his example either, only the harder knowledge that courage sometimes arrives late, and that a life's worth of quiet care could still, in the end, count for something even when it never found its own voice in time. She continued teaching at the Cascade Falls schoolhouse for many years afterward, and made a quiet habit, each autumn, of walking her newest class up the Falls trail on a fine afternoon, telling them nothing of the cabin behind the water but simply letting them stand a while in the spray, watching their faces settle into the same wondering stillness her own father had once taught her to bring to any patch of ground worth truly looking at. Anders Lindgren took to bringing his own grandchildren up the Falls trail most summers, showing them the water their family had nearly lost everything defending, and told them, each time, some fresh version of the story of the schoolteacher and the hidden cabin, though its heart never changed in the telling. He liked to end the telling, more often than not, standing at the base of the falls with his grandchildren beside him, remarking that the valley had spent 30 years believing the truth was lost forever, when it had simply been waiting, patient as the water itself, for someone willing to climb up and look behind the curtain. And on quiet evenings, once her own cabin's lamp was the only light left burning at the base of Widow's Vale, Iris would sometimes take down Marcus Teal's original survey and read again its final hopeful line, written by a man who never lived to see his courage finally vindicated, and feel, every time, the particular, settled satisfaction of a debt 3 decades overdue finally, honestly paid. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Iris's story tonight, and for staying with her through both the fall's long silence and the truth it finally let her carry into the light. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs the reminder that the things the world calls worthless are sometimes only waiting for a patient hand to prove otherwise. And we would love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off, and what did it take for you to finally see it clearly? Tell us in the comments below, we read every single one. Until next time, stay close.